The night air of Rome trembled with heat and fear. Torches hissed as they burned, their light casting long, quivering shadows across marble facades and cobblestone streets. The smell of smoke, sweat, and blood mingled into a suffocating haze that clung to the city's heart. In the amphitheaters, thousands of voices roared as one, rising and falling like the tide against the cries of the condemned. Here, amid spectacle and silence, a question haunted the stones. Why does faith threaten an empire more than sword or fire? Rome was a civilization that prided itself on order, on the weight of law, and on the magnificence of its gods. Its pantheon stretched across centuries, filled with deities who embodied every aspect of life: war, harvest, hearth, and sea. To honor them was not only a matter of belief, but of civic duty, a loyalty test to the empire itself. Yet in hidden corners, in rooms lit only by flickering oil lamps, a fragile community gathered to whisper prayers not to Jupiter or Mars, but to a crucified man from Judea. This faith, so small in number, would soon command the attention of the most powerful empire the world had ever known. The paradox was sharp. Rome could tolerate countless gods, but it could not tolerate the exclusivity of one. To refuse the altar, to decline sacrifice, was more than impiety, it was treason. And so, persecution was born not from misunderstanding alone, but from a fundamental collision of loyalty. The empire demanded one kind of devotion, the Christians gave it to another. In this collision, stories unfolded that would forever shape human memory. Mothers carried their children to prisons rather than deny their Lord. Bold men walked calmly to the stake, their silence louder than any rebellion. Young women, barely past childhood, sang hymns as beasts were unleashed upon them. These were not merely deaths, they were dramas of defiance, spectacles that Rome intended for fear, but that became seeds of something greater. History has preserved the names of emperors, senators, and generals, yet beneath their grandeur lies another record, etched in letters, carved into catacomb walls, and passed down through the trembling voices of survivors. It is the story of those who lived in shadows, who prayed in secret, and who believed that no chain could bind the soul. The persecution of Christians in pagan Rome was not one single event, but a rhythm periods of fire and silence, of violent suppression and uneasy tolerance. From Nero's infamous cruelty to the systematic policies of Diocletian, the empire's hand fell again and again upon those who dared to call themselves followers of Christ. But persecution also forged identity. What Rome intended as destruction became the crucible in which the Church was shaped, refined, and strengthened. Imagine, then, the weight of these centuries, the glow of burning cities, the cries from beneath the Colosseum, the whispered prayers of prisoners. Each moment was both tragedy and testimony, for in the ashes of their suffering, Christians found a strange conviction that blood could be seed, that silence could thunder, that memory could outlast empire. This journey will carry us from the humble gatherings in Judea to the echoing catacombs beneath Rome, from the torches of Nero to the vision of Constantine. It is a story of pain and hope, of shadows and dawn. It is a reminder that faith is not born in comfort, but often in fire. And so, we begin beneath the torches of Rome, where shadows flicker, where memory stirs, and where one question still burns. What is stronger, the empire of men, or the endurance of the human spirit when it clings to faith? The empire of Rome stretched from the misty isles of Britannia to the deserts of Arabia, from the fertile Nile to the icy frontiers of the Danube. Within this vast dominion, countless peoples paid homage to countless gods. Yet in a small, troubled province at the empire's eastern edge, an event occurred that Rome scarcely noticed at first. A young Jewish teacher was executed on a wooden cross. His name was Jesus of Nazareth. To Rome, his death was insignificant. Crucifixion was routine, a punishment reserved for slaves and rebels, one of thousands carried out under the watch of imperial governors. The Roman procurator Pontius Pilate, impatient with local unrest, signed the sentence with little thought. Soldiers hammered nails into flesh, lifted the cross, and left the condemned to die slowly in the sun. The crowd dispersed. The empire continued, unchanged, or so it seemed. But beneath the surface, something stirred. Those who had followed Jesus whispered that his death was not the end. They spoke of an empty tomb, of appearances that defied explanation, of a promise that he had risen from death. These whispers moved like fire across dry grass, fragile, easily extinguished, yet impossible to contain. The first followers were not mighty men of Rome, but fishermen, artisans, and women whose names might otherwise have been lost to time. They gathered in homes, breaking bread, recalling his words. Love your enemies. Blessed are the poor. Forgive, not 7 times, but 70 times 7. Such teachings ran against the grain of Roman virtue, which prized honor, strength, and vengeance. To live as Christ commanded was, in many ways, to live against the empire itself. At first, Christianity was not seen as a new religion, but as a sect within Judaism, and Judaism, though often distrusted, was tolerated in Rome as an ancient faith. Yet the difference soon became clear. While Jews might offer sacrifices for the emperor's well-being, Christians would not. Their allegiance was to one God alone, invisible and unyielding. In the temples of Rome, smoke rose to Jupiter and Mars. In hidden rooms, Christians lifted prayers only to Christ. It was this refusal that marked them as dangerous. They were not rebels in arms, yet their defiance of civic religion was rebellion of another kind. Rome had conquered nations, subdued armies, and razed cities, but here was a people whose loyalty could not be purchased or coerced. The earliest persecutions did not come from emperors, but from neighbors. Rumors spread quickly. Christians were accused of secret crimes. They met in darkness, surely they plotted treason. They called one another brother and sister. Surely their gatherings hid incest. They ate bread and wine as the body and blood of Christ. Surely they were cannibals. Fear breeds suspicion, and suspicion breeds hostility. Yet despite ridicule and slander, the faith spread from Jerusalem to Antioch, from Corinth to Rome itself. Small communities multiplied. Letters circulated Paul's words to the Corinthians, John's visions from Patmos. These writings bound the scattered faithful into a single story, a story of suffering and hope. Why did it spread, this fragile, forbidden faith? Perhaps because it offered what Rome could not. To the poor, it gave dignity. To the slave, it promised freedom of the soul. To women, often silenced in public, it gave a voice in worship. To the weary, it offered a kingdom not of this world. And above all, it gave meaning to suffering, teaching that pain endured in faith was not wasted, but transformed into glory. Still, its growth drew notice. By the middle of the 1st century, Rome itself housed a Christian community. They met quietly, often in the homes of wealthier converts. Slaves and masters, men and women, Jews and Gentiles shared the same bread, breaking barriers that society held sacred. In a world obsessed with hierarchy, such equality was revolutionary. The empire watched with wary eyes, a sect that grew in silence, that refused the gods, that spoke of another kingdom. Such a movement could not remain invisible forever. Soon, its presence would clash with imperial power in ways that neither side could ignore. For now, however, the faith remained small but steadfast. Like a seed buried in the earth, unseen yet alive, it carried within it the potential to split stone and overturn empires. Rome believed itself eternal, its gods unshakable. But in shadowed rooms by whispered prayers, a new chapter of history was beginning, one written not with ink but with blood. And so, the question lingered in the darkness. What is it that draws humanity to risk all for belief, even when belief demands suffering? The Roman Empire was not merely a political machine. It was a tapestry woven with gods, rituals, and traditions as old as the city itself. To be Roman was to participate in the sacred rhythms of public religion, to sacrifice at the altars, to honor the spirits of ancestors, to pour wine for the household gods. Every oath, every festival, every civic duty was bound to the divine. Temples stood like sentinels in every city, their columns rising toward the heavens. Within their sanctuaries, priests offered incense and blood. The air smelled of smoke, of roasted flesh, of perfume. The people prayed for harvests, for victory, for protection from plague. Religion was not only belief, it was obligation, a bond between citizen and state. To neglect sacrifice was to risk the favor of the gods, and thus the security of the empire itself. The Roman pantheon was vast. Jupiter thundered from the skies, Mars marched with soldiers, Vesta kept the eternal flame, Venus stirred desire in hearts. Conquered peoples brought their gods into Rome, and the empire welcomed them. Isis of Egypt, Mithras of Persia, Cybele of Phrygia, all found a place beneath Rome's wide embrace. To Rome, the more gods, the stronger the empire. But beneath this inclusivity lay a crucial principle. While many gods could be worshipped, the emperor must be honored above all. From Augustus onward, the cult of the emperor became central. Sacrifice to the emperor was not simply religion, it was patriotism. To burn incense at his image was to declare loyalty to Rome. To refuse was to set oneself apart, to brand oneself an enemy. And here the Christians stood apart. They did not refuse all rituals. Indeed, they prayed for emperors, for peace, for the safety of the land. But they would not sacrifice to Caesar. They would not bend the knee to images of gods fashioned in stone. They proclaimed one God, unseen yet sovereign, who reigned not in marble temples but in heaven. This exclusivity bewildered the Romans. How could anyone deny the gods who had protected the city since its founding? To deny them was arrogance, impiety, even madness. To Romans, Christians seemed like atheists, dangerous, ungrateful, and subversive. Their refusal was not only personal belief, it was a challenge to the very fabric of civic life. And yet, for the Christians, this refusal was not rebellion but fidelity. To them, the gods of Rome were idols, powerless before the Creator of all. Their loyalty belonged to Christ alone, who had conquered death itself. No incense, no altar, no emperor could claim what belonged to God. This conflict was not immediately a matter of armies or laws, but of daily life. A soldier asked to sacrifice before battle, a magistrate required to pour libations during ceremonies, a market vendor compelled to join festivals. For the Christian, each moment was a test, to conform and survive, or to resist and suffer. It was a silent war, fought not with swords but with choices, and in those choices the empire saw danger. For what Rome feared most was not rebellion in arms, but disunity in spirit. An empire as vast as Rome survived only through shared rituals and collective loyalty. To withdraw from that harmony was to weaken its foundation. Thus, the stage was set for conflict. The empire of gods and men, proud of its power, could not tolerate a faith that claimed all gods were false. And the Christians, fragile but resolute, could not betray the one they called Lord. It was a collision no one could prevent. Sooner or later, Rome would unleash its fury upon those who refused its altars. And so we arrive at the threshold of flame, where torches will burn not only in temples but in gardens of horror. As dawn yields to fire, the question grows sharper. When loyalty to God defies loyalty to empire, where does the soul find its courage to stand? The summer of 64 CE was unlike any Rome had known. The city sweltered beneath the heat of July when, on a fateful night, flames erupted near the Circus Maximus. At first, it seemed another of the frequent fires that plagued the crowded capital, but this one spread with terrifying speed. The winds fanned sparks from timber roof to timber roof, leaping across alleys and climbing hills. Soon, the eternal city burned. The crackle of fire drowned out the cries of families fleeing with whatever possessions they could carry. Roofs caved in, temples collapsed, warehouses of grain and oil exploded in pillars of flame. The air filled with smoke so thick that day turned to night. Witnesses spoke of screams mingling with the roar of the inferno, of entire districts consumed in hours. For 6 days and 7 nights, Rome was a cauldron of fire and terror. When at last the flames died, 2/3 of the city lay in ruins. Homeless citizens wandered among ashes, their eyes hollow with despair. Anger swelled as questions spread. Who was to blame? Whispers began to circle the emperor himself. Nero had long been suspected of vanity and madness. Some said he wanted to clear space for his golden house, a palace of unimaginable luxury. Others swore they had seen men spreading fire at the emperor's command. Whether true or not, the rumors stuck, and fury turned toward the throne. Nero, desperate to divert suspicion, sought a scapegoat. He found one in the Christians. They were already viewed with suspicion, strange, secretive, accused of atheism and treachery. To the angry masses, their refusal of the gods made them perfect culprits. The accusations spread like wildfire. Christians had plotted the blaze. Christians had cursed the city. Christians had defied the gods. Rome's wrath, already stoked by suffering, demanded blood, and Nero was ready to provide it. The persecution began swiftly. Arrests filled the prisons. Men and women were dragged from their homes, beaten in the streets, bound in chains. In the courts, confessions were extracted under torture. One name led to another, and soon the net of suspicion encompassed entire communities. But Nero's cruelty did not stop at executions. He turned death into spectacle. In his gardens, Christians were nailed to crosses, smeared with pitch, and set ablaze as living torches. The smell of burning flesh mingled with the scent of flowers as Nero strolled among the flames dressed in theatrical costume, delighting in the glow that lit his banquets. Others were torn apart by dogs, sewn into animal skins to be hunted as prey. Some were thrown into the arena, where beasts devoured them before jeering crowds. To Rome it was entertainment. To the victims it was martyrdom. Amid the horror, stories of courage spread. Believers sang hymns as flames rose around them. Some prayed for their executioners, others went silently, their faces calm, as though death itself had lost its sting. One tale speaks of Peter, the apostle, who was said to have been crucified in Rome during Nero's reign. Tradition holds that he asked to be nailed upside down, declaring himself unworthy to die in the same manner as his Lord. Whether history or legend, the story carried power, strengthening those who still lived. The blood of the martyrs became a seed of defiance. Instead of erasing Christianity, Nero's cruelty gave it shape. Those who witnessed the spectacles whispered of the victim's dignity. Some were moved to join the faith they had once mocked. The empire had sought to instill fear, but faith proved contagious even in fire. Yet the persecution also revealed the fragility of this new movement. Many fell away under pressure, denying Christ to save their lives. Others, branded traitors, returned later in repentance, raising fierce debates within the church. Should the lapsed be forgiven or forever cast out? Already, persecution was not only testing bodies, but tearing at the soul of the community. In the ashes of 64 CE, Rome rebuilt itself. Nero's golden house rose gleaming where ruins once smoldered, a palace of marble, gold, and fountains. But beneath its splendor lay the memory of suffering, the echo of screams, the smell of burning flesh. Rome had silenced its critics with blood, but the stain could not be erased. Nero himself would not escape fate. His reign of cruelty spiraled into chaos, and within a few years he was declared an enemy of the state. Cornered and abandoned, he ended his life with the blade of a dagger, crying, "What an artist dies in me!" Yet his name remained forever tied to infamy, a shadow across history. The Christians, however, endured, bruised, scattered, but unbroken. They carried their memories forward. To them, Nero was not merely a tyrant, but the embodiment of empire's madness. His fire had not destroyed them. It had baptized them into suffering. Thus began a rhythm that would repeat for centuries: persecution, endurance, survival. The Empire of Rome had made its choice to see faith as threat and to answer it with cruelty. But in fire and in blood, Christianity found its voice. And so the question burned on, fiercer than any torch. When an empire wields fear as its weapon, what unseen strength allows the faithful to walk calmly into flame? The Colosseum rose above Rome like a stone crown, its arches vast enough to swallow the cries of tens of thousands. To step inside was to enter another world, a world where power, cruelty, and theater mingled into one. Beneath its awnings, senators, merchants, and slaves alike gathered, their faces lit by anticipation. The arena floor was a stage, and blood was its script. For Rome, the games were more than entertainment. They were rituals of dominance, reminders that the empire's reach was unshakable. Gladiators fought, not merely for survival, but to embody Rome's ideals of courage and strength. Exotic beasts, dragged from Africa and Asia, paraded before astonished eyes. The roar of lions, the clash of steel, the thunder of applause, all of it was spectacle designed to remind the people of Rome's glory. But into this theater of death stepped those whom the empire despised most, the Christians. Dragged from prisons, they were thrust into the arena as criminals, though their crime was only faith. Some were bound to stakes, left defenseless as beasts were released. Lions padded across the sand, their manes bristling, their jaws dripping with hunger. The crowd leaned forward, hearts pounding with anticipation. The first screams came quickly, yet sometimes not from the victims. There were tales of lions halting, of beasts refusing to attack, as if nature itself recoiled. When this happened, Executioners ensured the spectacle continued, blades cut where claws would not. Rome's honor could not be shamed by hesitation. Other times, Christians were forced to fight each other, untrained and terrified, as the crowd demanded death for amusement. Still others were clothed in animal skins, hunted by dogs, their cries echoing against the marble walls. And yet, amid the cruelty, something astonishing happened. Many did not plead for mercy, nor curse their captors. They sang. Hymns rose above the noise of the crowd, fragile but steady, words of hope in the face of horror. Witnesses spoke of men and women standing calmly as death approached, their silence or their song cutting through the roar of the arena like a blade. Such courage bewildered Rome. Death was meant to humiliate, to terrify, to extinguish. Yet here were victims who embraced it as testimony. Their calm defiance unsettled even the hardened spectators. Some, it was said, left the games changed, whispering to themselves of the God who gave such strength. One story preserved in memory tells of Ignatius of Antioch, an aged bishop taken to Rome in chains. In his letters, written along the journey, he spoke not of fear, but of longing. "Let me be food for the beasts," he wrote, "that I may be found pure bread for Christ." When at last he entered the arena, it was said that he welcomed the lions as though greeting old friends. His death was spectacle for Rome, but for Christians it was sacrament. Not all met death so serenely. Some trembled, some cried, some faltered at the last. But even these failures were remembered with compassion, for the early church understood that courage was not always loud, and martyrdom was not measured only in hymns. To endure at all was testimony enough. The arena itself became a paradox. Rome sought to use it as a weapon of fear, a place where faith would be crushed before the eyes of thousands, but instead it became a pulpit of blood. Each death preached a sermon more powerful than any words. The more Rome displayed its cruelty, the more Christianity spread, not because people desired suffering, but because they saw in that suffering a truth no empire could destroy. And so the Colosseum, symbol of Rome's triumph, became also a symbol of its failure. Its stones absorbed the cries of the faithful. Its sand drank their blood. Centuries later, pilgrims would look upon its ruins and see not the pride of emperors, but the endurance of martyrs. For the Christians, these deaths were not the end. Letters circulated, stories retold, names remembered. In secret gatherings, believers spoke of those who had stood firm. They carved symbols of fish and crosses in catacomb walls, reminding each other that death was not defeat, but transformation. The empire wanted silence. Instead, it created memory. And memory, once born, cannot be unmade. So the arena, built to glorify Rome, glorified instead the faith it sought to erase. The laughter of crowds faded with time, but the hymns of martyrs echo still. And here the question lingers, written across the arches of stone and the shadows of history. What power is greater, to kill with sword and beast, or to die with faith unbroken? Beneath the bustling streets of Rome, where carts rattled and merchants shouted, a different world waited in silence. Tunnels carved into soft volcanic rock stretched for miles, a labyrinth of darkness lit only by trembling lamps. These were the catacombs, the hidden veins of the city, where the dead were laid to rest, and where the living sometimes gathered to pray. The air was damp, heavy with the scent of earth and dust. Narrow corridors wound past niches carved into the walls, each one a resting place sealed with stone. Some bore simple inscriptions in peace. Others carried symbols, a fish, a shepherd, a dove. These marks spoke in silence of a faith that dared not declare itself aloud. Here, the Christians buried their dead with dignity. In a world where persecution could deny them public mourning, the catacombs became sacred ground. They were not merely cemeteries, but sanctuaries of memory. By lamplight, families carved epitaphs, telling stories of mothers, children, martyrs. The names whispered in these tunnels outlasted the voices that once spoke them. And in times of danger, the catacombs became more than places of burial. They became shelters for the living, meeting places for worshippers who could not gather openly above. In these shadowed halls, hymns rose softly, prayers carried on trembling voices, bread was broken, wine was poured, and the memory of Christ's sacrifice was renewed. The empire demanded silence, but in these depths, silence itself became a kind of prayer. The catacombs also preserved art paintings of a shepherd carrying a lamb, of Jonah emerging from the whale, of a banquet of bread and fish. These images, simple yet profound, spoke of hope in resurrection, of life beyond the grave. To the faithful, they were not decoration but proclamation, that death was not the end, but a passage. Roman authorities sometimes mocked Christians as cowards for hiding underground. But the catacombs were not places of fear, they were places of resistance. To descend into them was to step into a world where the empire's reach could not follow. Down there, beneath the weight of earth, believers found freedom of a kind unknown in daylight. Yet the catacombs were not without peril. Informers lurked, eager for reward. Raids sometimes pierced the underground refuge. Arrests were made, and those caught faced prison or death. Still the tunnels remained, carved deeper, stretching further, as though the earth itself conspired to shelter those who bore faith's burden. For the early Christians, memory was their strength. They did not have great armies, nor wealth, nor monuments, but they had names, names inscribed in stone, names spoken in prayer. In remembering their dead, they defied the empire's attempt to erase them. Each epitaph was an act of defiance, a refusal to let silence consume the past. Centuries later, pilgrims would descend into these tunnels and see in their walls the quiet testimony of courage. They would touch the stones, trace the carved fish, and feel the presence of those who had lived and died for faith. The catacombs, once hidden, would become monuments to endurance. In their silence they speak still. They remind us that power often shouts, but truth endures in whispers. They remind us that memory, carved into stone, can outlast empire. And as we leave the shadows of the catacombs, one reflection lingers, like the echo of footsteps in stone. Is it not in silence, more than in shouting, that faith proves its deepest strength? Long before the church held cathedrals or councils, it had voices fierce, steady voices that refused to be silenced. When Rome accused, mocked, and condemned, these voices answered with words sharpened by faith. They were the apologists, the early defenders of Christianity, who dared to speak truth before emperors and philosophers alike. Among them was Justin, later called the martyr. A philosopher by training, he wore the cloak of wisdom that marked the seekers of truth. He had studied Plato, admired the Stoics, and walked among the great schools of thought. Yet he found in Christ what no philosopher could provide, not only wisdom, but salvation. In his apologies, written to the emperors themselves, Justin declared boldly that Christians were not criminals, nor atheists, nor enemies of the state. They were lovers of truth, worshippers of the one God, and citizens who prayed for the empire, even as the empire despised them. His words carried a paradox that Rome struggled to grasp. Christians disobeyed the empire's altars, yet obeyed its laws. They refused its gods, yet prayed for its peace. "We do not seek to escape death," Justin wrote, "for if we are killed for the name of Christ, we will be saved." His arguments were not only defense, but defiance, proclaiming that no sword could cut down truth. Others followed, each voice adding strength to the growing chorus. Tertullian of Carthage, sharp as a blade, confronted Rome with fiery rhetoric. He mocked the absurdity of blaming Christians for every misfortune. If the Tiber rises, if the Nile does not flood, if famine strikes or plague spreads, at once the cry is heard, "The Christians to the lions." His sarcasm pierced Roman arrogance, but beneath it lay profound conviction. It was Tertullian who coined words that echoed through centuries. The blood of the martyrs is the seed of the church. These apologists did not write only for emperors, they wrote for the faithful. Their works became lifelines for communities struggling to endure. To read their words was to find courage, to remember that suffering was not meaningless, that truth could be spoken even from prison cells. The voices were not only of men, women, too, bore testimony through letters and acts of defiance. The Passion of Perpetua and Felicitas, preserved from the early 3rd century, tells the story of a noblewoman and her slave who faced death in the arena together. Perpetua, a young mother, kept a diary in prison. In it, she described visions of ladders reaching to heaven, of battles with dragons, of Christ welcoming her. Her words, fragile and human, spoke across centuries with a clarity no executioner could silence. "Stand fast in the faith," she urged, "and love one another. Do not let our suffering become a stumbling block." In these testimonies, philosophy and prophecy joined hands. Rome had its senators, orators, and poets. The Christians, without power or prestige, offered instead the raw truth of witness. They turned accusations upside down. To be mocked as weak became proof of strength. To be condemned as criminals became evidence of innocence. Where the empire expected silence, they answered with song. Where it expected despair, they offered hope. Their voices echoed not only in scrolls but in memory. Letters were copied, smuggled, read aloud in gatherings by lamplight. Communities scattered across the empire, from Africa to Asia Minor, found unity in these words. For if the empire sought to scatter, the apologists sought to gather. If the empire sought to erase, they sought to remember. Yet every word written carried risk. To declare oneself Christian openly was to risk arrest, torture, death. Each letter was a gamble, each scroll a potential death sentence. But the words endured, carried forward by hands willing to risk everything to preserve them. Through them, a pattern emerges. Persecution was not only fire and sword, it was also debate, accusation, and slander. And against these, the Christians fought with the only weapon they had, the truth spoken aloud. The empire's rhetoric thundered in marble halls. The Christians' voices whispered in shadows. But over time, it was the whispers that endured. For words, once born, have a way of outlasting empires. And so, as we leave this chorus of defiance, we are left with a reflection: what is the true strength of a voice? Is it the volume with which it shouts, or the endurance with which it speaks truth, even when silence is safer? The empire remembered Nero's madness, but it did not abandon cruelty. After years of uneasy calm, a new shadow fell across Rome. It was the reign of Domitian, 8196 CE, a ruler both admired and feared, who cloaked his insecurity with absolute authority. Domitian was not mad in the way Nero had been. He was deliberate, calculating, relentless. He restored discipline to the legions, strengthened the borders, and demanded loyalty in every corner of the empire. Yet, beneath his order, lurked suspicion, the paranoia of a man who trusted no one. He called himself Dominus et Deus, Lord, and God, and expected all to bow. For Christians, such demands struck at the heart of faith. To honor the emperor was one thing, to worship him was another. Their refusal to bend the knee, already suspicious in Roman eyes, now appeared treasonous. And in a reign where shadows of conspiracy seemed everywhere, treason could not be tolerated. Accusations multiplied. Jews and Christians alike were targeted, for Domitian's policies blurred the line between them. The old tax on Jews, the Fiscus Judaicus, was harshly enforced, and Christians, many of whom had Jewish roots, were swept up in its net. Informers thrived, seizing property under pretext of impiety. In the whispers of neighbors and the malice of rivals, faith became a liability. Stories tell of exiles and executions. Among the most famous was Flavius Clemens, a cousin of the emperor himself, condemned for atheism, a charge often leveled at Christians. His wife, Domitilla, was banished to an island. That even the emperor's own kin could be accused revealed the depth of Domitian's suspicion. No one was safe from the shadows. It was during this time, many believed, that the Apostle John was exiled to the rocky island of Patmos. There, amid crashing waves and barren cliffs, he received visions of beasts, of persecution, of a new heaven and earth. The book of Revelation, born from exile, spoke to Christians under tyranny. Its imagery of empires rising and falling, of the Lamb triumphant, became both warning and comfort. Rome might roar like a beast, but its power was not eternal. For the Christians, Domitian's persecution was not as wide-reaching as Nero's spectacle, but it was more insidious. It was not only fire and blood, but exile, confiscation, suspicion. It was the slow erosion of safety, the constant awareness that faith marked one for danger. The empire did not always kill with swords. Sometimes it killed with silence, isolation, and fear. Yet even in exile, voices endured. Letters traveled across seas, carrying encouragement. Communities gathered still, whispering prayers in houses and catacombs. The memory of Christ's resurrection remained stronger than the emperor's paranoia. Domitian's reign ended suddenly. In 96 CE, conspirators struck him down in his own palace. The Senate, weary of his tyranny, declared his memory condemned, his statues destroyed, his name erased from inscriptions. The empire turned its face quickly from the man who had demanded to be called a god. And so Domitian passed into shadow, his power dissolved like smoke. But the Christians remained. His suspicion had scarred them, yet it also deepened their identity. To be Christian was to live beneath suspicion, to accept exile, to endure whispers. Rome had sought to erase their presence, yet it was Domitian's name that was erased, not theirs. In the irony of history, the persecutor vanished, while the persecuted endured. And so, as the shadow of Domitian recedes, one reflection remains. Is not the true measure of power found not in how long it commands obedience, but in whether its memory endures with honor or in shame? The death of Domitian left Rome weary of tyranny. In his place arose a different kind of ruler, Emperor Trajan, 98, 117 CE, soldier, statesman, builder of cities. His reign was remembered as one of Rome's golden ages, an era of conquest abroad and prosperity at home. Yet, even in this age of stability, the shadow of persecution lingered, for the question of the Christians remained unresolved. Trajan was no Nero, reveling in cruelty, nor a Domitian steeped in paranoia. He was pragmatic, a man of law and order. To govern an empire so vast, he sought clarity, structure, policy, and in the matter of Christians, clarity was sorely needed. The dilemma came to him from Bithynia, a distant province on the empire's northern frontier. Its governor, Pliny the Younger, found himself entangled in a problem he had not anticipated. Letters survive fragments of Roman bureaucracy, turned windows into history. Pliny wrote to the emperor, in careful Latin, describing how accusations against Christians filled his courts. He was uncertain how to proceed. Should he punish all Christians, or only those who defied orders? Should age or status be considered? Was mere confession of the name a crime, or only certain actions? He explained his method so far. Those accused were brought before him and asked to worship the gods of Rome, to offer wine and incense before the image of the emperor. If they complied, he released them. If they refused, he executed them. Some, under threat, denied their faith. Others stood firm, embracing death. Pliny was unsettled by their stubbornness. Whatever the nature of their belief, he confessed, the sheer obstinacy deserves punishment. And yet, he admitted, he found nothing criminal in their practices. They met before dawn to sing hymns to Christ as to a god. They bound themselves not to crime, but to honesty, promising to avoid theft, adultery, deceit. They shared simple meals. Pliny confessed he saw nothing dangerous in this, save their refusal to honor the gods. Still, the numbers troubled him. Christians were everywhere. Villages, towns, even cities saw temples empty as faith spread. It was not rebellion in arms, but it eroded the empire's unity all the same. Trajan's reply was measured, pragmatic, and chilling. He instructed Pliny not to hunt Christians out actively. Yet, if they were accused and refused to sacrifice, they must be punished. Anonymous denunciations, he added, should not be accepted, for they encouraged malice and falsehood. Thus the empire's policy was set. Christianity was not to be sought, but neither was it to be tolerated. It was, in effect, a crime of identity. The mere confession of the name, when tested, was enough to bring death. This correspondence reveals the heart of Rome's struggle. The empire did not fear Christian crimes, it feared Christian difference. To refuse sacrifice was to reject the glue that held the empire together. Loyalty was not only political but religious, and the Christians' refusal to blend faith with Rome's rituals struck at the very heart of unity. For the Christians, Trajan's policy was a double-edged sword. They were spared mass hunts and purges, but lived under constant threat. At any moment, an accusation could drag them to court. Their fate depended not on crimes committed, but on the choice of conscience. Burn incense to Caesar, or die. The stories of this time tell of both weakness and courage. Some bent under pressure, offering sacrifice with trembling hands, then weeping in repentance afterward. Others stood firm, their silence more eloquent than argument. Their martyrdoms were remembered, their names inscribed in the memory of the faithful. The dilemma of Trajan was the dilemma of Rome itself. Could an empire of many peoples tolerate a faith that demanded exclusive allegiance? Could unity survive when some citizens refused the rituals that bound it together? Rome answered with compromise. Tolerate in silence, punish when exposed, yet this compromise carried seeds of tension that would outlast Trajan himself. For the Christians, the policy revealed something deeper, that the empire was less concerned with justice than with conformity. They learned that to follow Christ was not only to pray in secret, but to risk accusation at any moment. And in that risk, their identity was sharpened. Faith became not only a belief, but a choice repeated with every day of danger. Thus, in the quiet exchange of letters between governor and emperor, a policy was born that would echo for generations. It was not the fire of Nero nor the paranoia of Domitian, but it was no less dangerous, for it was law, and law endures. And so the question that haunted the courts of Bithynia still haunts us. Is truth measured by obedience to law, or by the conscience that dares to resist it? The empire was vast, and so too was the reach of persecution. From Asia Minor to Gaul, the rhythm of accusation and death echoed like distant thunder. 2 episodes in particular, Lyons in Gaul and Smyrna in Asia Minor, etched themselves into memory with a clarity that has endured for centuries. They reveal not only the cruelty of empire, but also the resilience of faith. The martyrs of Lyons, 177 CE. In the city of Lugdunum, modern-day Lyons, Christians faced hostility that burned hotter than summer. The population, stirred by rumors and superstition, accused the faithful of unspeakable crimes. They were said to be cannibals, incestuous, enemies of the gods. Hatred grew until the city itself seemed to conspire against them. The persecution began with arrests. Slaves were tortured to extract confessions, their bodies broken in search of words to satisfy suspicion. What emerged was not truth, but slander, yet the mob demanded blood. The governor, pressed by fury, ordered executions. The letter that survives from the Church of Lyons describes in vivid detail the horrors that followed. Believers were dragged before crowds, beaten with clubs, thrown to beasts, burned alive. Some recanted, their courage broken. Others stood firm, their silence louder than screams. One figure shone above the rest, Blandina, a slave woman, frail in body yet unyielding in spirit. She endured tortures from dawn until dusk, lashed, burned, pierced, yet she repeated only one phrase: "I am a Christian, and nothing wicked is done among us." Her tormentors, exhausted by her endurance, marveled that such weakness could outlast their strength. Finally, she was thrown into the arena, where beasts tore at her, and a sword ended her life. But her testimony did not end. The letter from Lyons preserved her name, carrying it across centuries. To the Church, she became the embodiment of courage, proof that strength is not of the flesh, but of the Spirit. The letter concludes not with despair, but with defiance. The martyrs, it declares, offered a banquet to Christ. Their deaths were written not as defeat, but as triumph. Rome had sought to erase. Instead, it had created memory. The martyrdom of Polycarp, Smyrna, approximately 155 CE. If Lyons gave the Church a letter, Smyrna gave it a story. Polycarp, Bishop of Smyrna, was old, perhaps 86 years in age, when persecution swept through his city. Arrested, he was urged to curse Christ and save his life. His reply became immortal: 86 years have I served him, and he has done me no wrong. How can I blaspheme my king who saved me? Brought into the arena, the crowd clamored for his death. The governor threatened him with beasts, with fire. Polycarp answered calmly, "That fire burns for a moment, but the fire of judgment lasts forever." The pyre was built, and the old man was bound. Eyewitnesses recorded that when the flames rose, they did not consume him as expected. Instead, his body seemed to glow, as if surrounded by a radiant light, and the air filled with a fragrance like bread baking or incense burning. At last, an executioner thrust a dagger into him, and his blood quenched the fire. The martyrdom of Polycarp, preserved by his own church, was the first such narrative after the New Testament. It became a model for how Christians remembered their dead, not as victims but as witnesses, their deaths retold as liturgy, their words repeated as scripture. Memory and meaning. Both Lyons and Smyrna reveal a crucial truth. Persecution did not destroy Christianity, it gave it a voice. The empire intended to frighten, but it inspired. It sought to erase, but it recorded. Through letters, diaries, and testimony, the suffering of Christians became not only memory but proclamation. The stories spread across provinces. Communities separated by seas and mountains heard of Blandina's courage, Polycarp's calm defiance, and found in them strength to endure their own trials. Rome's cruelty meant to isolate, instead united. And within these memories lies a paradox. The weak became strong, the slaves became free, the old became radiant. Faith turned the logic of empire upside down. The arena, meant to shame, became a pulpit. The pyre, meant to destroy, became a beacon. The executioner's blade became a pen, writing history in strokes of blood. Reflection. The martyrs of Lyons and Smyrna remind us that faith is not preserved by comfort, but by courage. Their voices, fragile yet unbroken, still echo through the centuries. They ask us to consider, when the world demands silence, what is the worth of a single voice that dares to speak? By the middle of the 3rd century, Rome stood at a crossroads. The empire was vast, but its strength was fraying. Borders strained under barbarian pressure. Provinces wavered in loyalty, and plagues thinned populations. In this climate of fear and uncertainty, Emperor Decius, 249-251 CE, rose with a vision: restore the ancient gods, restore Rome. To Decius, the decline of Rome was not merely political or military, it was spiritual. The gods, long neglected, had turned their faces away. Temples stood empty, sacrifices went unoffered, and among the culprits were the Christians, whose defiance of the altars had become infamous. To him their refusal was not private conviction, but public treason, a corrosion of unity in a time when unity meant survival. And so, in 250 CE, Decius issued an edict unlike any before it. For the first time, the entire empire was ordered to sacrifice to the gods. Every citizen in every province had to appear before officials, burn incense, pour wine, and affirm loyalty. Compliance was recorded on certificates called labelli, proof of piety, proof of loyalty. Without such a certificate, one could not live securely in the empire. The policy was clear, cold, and devastating. It was no longer a matter of chance, accusation, or local hostility. It was law. Every Christian was placed in a dilemma: obey the edict and betray the faith, or refuse and face imprisonment, torture, death. The shock was immense. Communities fractured. Some believers, trembling, complied and obtained certificates. Others bribed officials to receive papers without sacrificing. Still others stood firm and paid with their lives. The edict revealed the fragile humanity of the Church, its courage, its fear, its divisions. One of the most haunting stories is that of the aged Bishop Fabian of Rome. Summoned before the authorities, he refused to yield. He was executed swiftly, his martyrdom remembered as the first fruit of Decius's policy. Across the empire, bishops, priests, and lay people alike faced the same choice. Some embraced martyrdom with serene faith. Others, broken by fear, faltered. The crisis left scars. Among those who survived were the lapsed Christians who had sacrificed or obtained false certificates. When the persecution eased, bitter debates tore through communities. Could the lapsed be forgiven? Should they be rebaptized? Or had they forever lost their place among the faithful? Some demanded harsh purity, refusing reconciliation. Others, like Cyprian of Carthage, argued for mercy, teaching that the Church must heal the broken, not cast them aside. This debate would shape Christianity for generations. For persecution tested not only the body, but the soul of the Church. It forced believers to ask, what is the meaning of grace? What is the measure of faith? The Edict of Decius did not last long. Within 2 years, the emperor was dead, slain in battle against the Goths. Ironically, the first Roman emperor to fall in war against foreign enemies. His great project to restore Rome through sacrifice perished with him, yet the damage he inflicted lingered. Communities bore the weight of wounds, both physical and spiritual. Still, from the ashes of this persecution, new strength arose. The courage of martyrs inspired awe. The repentance of the lapsed taught humility. The debates over mercy forged theology. In trying to break the Church, Decius had forced it to confront itself, to clarify its identity. Rome believed that unity came through sacrifice to the gods. But the Christians discovered that their unity came through endurance, through forgiveness, through the memory of those who would not bow. The age of Decius revealed a truth that empire could never comprehend. Faith cannot be measured by certificates or enforced by law. It lives in conscience, hidden yet unshakable. And so, as the empire buried another emperor and prepared for the storms yet to come, one reflection rose from the ashes of sacrifice and debate. Is faith proven by perfection, without fault, or by the courage to return after failure and to endure despite weakness? The death of Decius on the battlefield did not end Rome's turmoil. The empire staggered under pressure, barbarians at the gates, plague in the cities, rivals rising and falling on distant frontiers. Amid this chaos, Emperor Valerian, 253–260 CE, ascended the throne. At first, he showed tolerance toward Christians, but within a few years, his policy turned to cruelty, and his name was etched into memory as one of the fiercest persecutors. Unlike Nero, who sought spectacle, or Decius, who demanded universal conformity, Valerian chose a different path. His persecution was precise, aimed at the heart of the Church. In 257 CE, he issued the first of 2 edicts. Christian leaders were forbidden from gathering for worship. Bishops, priests, and deacons were ordered to perform sacrifices to the gods or face exile. Lay people who refused could lose their property and titles. The logic was clear. Strike at the shepherds and the flock would scatter. Silence the leaders and the faith would wither. But the strategy miscalculated the resilience of memory and the courage of those who led. When the first edict failed to extinguish the movement, Valerian struck harder. In 258 CE, a second edict commanded the execution of bishops, priests, and deacons who refused sacrifice. Wealthy Christians of rank were stripped of status, their property confiscated. Even members of the imperial household were not spared. The empire, bleeding from external threats, turned inward to bleed its own citizens. Among the martyrs of this time was Sixtus II, Bishop of Rome. He was seized while celebrating the Eucharist in a cemetery, dragged before authorities, and executed with 4 deacons at his side. His calm composure in the face of death left a lasting impression, a quiet dignity that strengthened those who survived. Another name stands luminous: Lawrence, a deacon of the Roman Church. When ordered to surrender the church's treasures to the prefect, he asked for 3 days to gather them. Then he returned, bringing not gold or jewels, but the poor, the widows, the sick, and the orphans. These, he declared, are the treasures of the church. Enraged, the prefect condemned him to a gruesome death roasted alive on a gridiron. Tradition records that even amid agony, Lawrence spoke with defiance, telling his executioners to turn him over, for one side was cooked. Whether apocryphal or true, the story captured the spirit of a faith that refused to be humiliated. In Carthage, Bishop Cyprian, who had wrestled with the question of how to treat the lapsed after Decius' persecution, now faced his own trial. Arrested, interrogated, and offered the chance to sacrifice, he refused. Calmly, he accepted his sentence. On the day of his execution, he removed his cloak, knelt in prayer, and stretched out his neck to the sword. His followers recorded that he met death with serenity, his final silence more powerful than any defense. These leaders, executed not in hidden corners but before crowds, became symbols of unshaken faith. Rome believed it was striking fear into the hearts of believers. Instead, it struck memory deeper into their souls. The stories of Sixtus, Lawrence, and Cyprian traveled swiftly across provinces, carried by letters and whispers, retold in secret gatherings. Valerian's policy, precise and merciless, revealed again the empire's misunderstanding. It thought the church was a structure that could collapse if its pillars were removed. But Christianity was not built on bishops or deacons alone. It was built on the testimony of all believers, from slaves to noble women, from children to the aged. Leaders fell, but the faith endured, carried by countless voices. Ironically, Valerian's reign ended not in triumph, but in humiliation. Captured in battle by the Persian king Shapur I, he lived out his final days as a prisoner. Ancient accounts, hostile to Rome, delighted in tales of his disgrace, that he was used as a human footstool, his skin flayed after death. Whether truth or exaggeration, the image of the mighty emperor reduced to servitude became a bitter symbol. The persecutor of Christians had been brought lower than any he condemned. For the church, this irony was not lost. They remembered Valerian not as a restorer of Rome, but as a persecutor whose own fate testified to the futility of empire's pride. His edicts were rescinded by his successor, and the survivors of persecution began again to rebuild. But the scars remained scars in memory, scars in theology. The blood of leaders had flowed freely, and the church had learned again that its strength did not lie in wealth or position, but in faith lived to the end. Rome's policy of targeting bishops and deacons revealed a deeper truth. Leadership in the church was never meant to be power, but service, and service, when it demanded blood, became the highest form of witness. Thus, from Valerian's cruelty rose a reflection that endures beyond his reign. When power seeks to break the shepherds, can it ever comprehend that the flock learns to follow not because of fear, but because of love that endures even unto death? The city of Carthage, jewel of North Africa, bustled with trade, culture, and politics. Its harbors welcomed ships from across the Mediterranean. Its markets overflowed with spices, grain, and silk. Amid this prosperity, a bishop named Cyprian became the heart of its Christian community. Learned, eloquent, and pastoral, he guided his flock through one of the most turbulent eras of persecution. Cyprian was not born into obscurity. He was a man of education and wealth, trained in rhetoric, skilled in the art of persuasion. His conversion to Christianity astonished his peers. In embracing the faith, he abandoned privilege for service, exchanging the forum for the altar, the rhetoric of courts for the language of prayer. Within a few years, he was chosen as Bishop of Carthage. His leadership was tested almost immediately. Under Emperor Decius, when all citizens were ordered to sacrifice to the gods, the Carthaginian church was torn apart. Some believers complied, others resisted, and still others bribed officials for false certificates. When the storm passed, the community fractured over the question of the lapsed. Should those who had yielded be cast out forever, or welcomed back through repentance? Cyprian argued for mercy, tempered by discipline. He urged that the lapsed be restored, but only through sincere repentance and reconciliation. To him, the church was not a fortress of the perfect, but a hospital for the wounded. His letters reveal a man both firm and compassionate, one who understood weakness, yet held fast to the call of holiness. But his greatest test came under Emperor Valerian. When the edicts of 257 and 258 struck, Cyprian became a prime target. First exiled from Carthage, he continued to write to his flock, guiding them from afar. His words strengthened the faithful, urging them to endure. "The Lord's commands are not burdensome," he wrote, "for he gives strength to those who confess him." In 258 CE, the second edict demanded the execution of bishops who refused to sacrifice. Cyprian was arrested and brought before the proconsul. The trial records, preserved by witnesses, show the stark exchange. "Are you Thasius Cyprian, the bishop of Carthage?" "I am." "The emperors command you to sacrifice." "I will not." "You will be executed." "Thanks be to God." No elaborate defense, no attempt at evasion, only calm acceptance. His refusal was not born of arrogance, but of certainty. For him, to betray Christ was unthinkable. To die for him was victory. On the day of his execution, crowds gathered outside the city. Cyprian was led to a field, accompanied by friends and followers who wept openly. He comforted them, reminding them of the hope beyond death. Removing his cloak, he knelt upon the earth. He prayed, then bound his own eyes with a cloth, a gesture of serenity. The executioner hesitated, unsettled by the dignity of his victim. Cyprian urged him to be brave, to do his duty. At last, the sword fell. The bishop's blood soaked the ground of Carthage, staining the earth with memory. For the church, his death was not the end of a leader, but the birth of a martyr. His writings, preserved and copied, became treasures of faith. His testimony, serene and steadfast, inspired generations. The blood of Cyprian became seed for the African church, which endured long after the empire that killed him began to fade. Cyprian's martyrdom reveals a paradox, that true authority lies not in the power to command armies, but in the willingness to suffer for others. Rome ruled by fear, Cyprian led by love. His calm death proclaimed more loudly than any sermon that faith is stronger than empire. Centuries later, pilgrims would visit the site of his execution. They would kneel upon the ground where his blood had fallen and remember the man who had turned a sword into testimony. And in reflecting upon Cyprian, we hear again the timeless question, what gives greater strength, the sword that takes life, or the faith that surrenders life willingly, and in so doing transforms death into victory? By the dawn of the 4th century, the Roman Empire trembled under the weight of its own size. Civil wars, economic decline, and constant invasions had weakened its once mighty frame. To restore Order, Emperor Diocletian, 284-305 CE, forged a new system, the Tetrarchy, rule by 4 emperors. Discipline, efficiency, and loyalty were his creed. For him, unity was survival, and Christianity, with its stubborn refusal to honor the gods, was a threat too dangerous to ignore. At first, Diocletian was cautious. He valued stability, and for nearly 2 decades Christians lived in relative peace, even rising to positions of authority. But within his court, voices called for suppression. Chief among them was Galerius, Diocletian's Caesar and son-in-law, a man of iron will and fierce hostility toward the faith. To him, the Christians' defiance endangered Rome itself. Their refusal to sacrifice risked the anger of the gods, and their growing numbers threatened imperial authority. The tension reached breaking point in 303 CE. In February, Diocletian ordered the destruction of the church at Nicomedia, where he resided. Soldiers stormed the building, tore down its walls, burned its scriptures. The following edict spread across the empire like fire. The first decree banned Christian worship, ordered the destruction of churches, and commanded the burning of sacred texts. The second demanded the arrest of clergy. The third compelled them to sacrifice or face torture. Finally, the fourth edict extended the command to all Christians: sacrifice to the gods or die. This was no sporadic outbreak, no local hostility. It was systematic, empire-wide, relentless. The great persecution. The violence was staggering. Churches were leveled, their stones scattered. Scriptures were seized and consigned to flames, as if Rome believed it could burn away the very memory of faith. Prisons overflowed, not with thieves or rebels, but with bishops, priests, and deacons. Torture chambers echoed with cries as the empire sought to break the resolve of believers. Some perished in fire, bound to stakes as flames consumed them. Others were beaten, scourged, or mutilated. Some were enslaved, their lives reduced to chains. The empire sought not merely to kill, but to erase, to wipe out worship, destroy memory, silence witness. And yet, amid the ashes, faith endured. In one city, Christians risked their lives to hide fragments of Scripture, burying them in fields or concealing them in walls. In another, secret gatherings continued by lamplight, hymns whispered so softly they could scarcely be heard. In Egypt, monks fled deeper into the desert, carrying the memory of Christ into silence. There were betrayals, too. Some surrendered scriptures to avoid death, earning the name traitors, those who handed over. Their actions tore at the fabric of the church, sparking fierce debates that would echo for decades. Was their betrayal unforgivable, or could grace restore them? Again, persecution tested not only the body but the soul of the community. The cruelty of the great persecution varied across the empire. In the west, under Constantius, enforcement was mild, churches destroyed but lives often spared. In the east, under Galerius, it was merciless. Whole communities were decimated. Families fled into wilderness, leaving behind homes and livelihoods. Cities once alive with prayer fell silent, their believers scattered or slain. Yet the persecution, like all storms, could not last forever. By 305 CE, Diocletian, exhausted by illness, abdicated his throne, the first Roman emperor to do so. His retirement to a palace on the Adriatic left Galerius ascendant, and the violence raged on. But cracks had formed. The empire was weary. Its strength stretched thin, and in the shadows the faith it sought to destroy endured still. The great persecution revealed once more the paradox of Rome's power. By burning scriptures, it made believers treasure them more deeply. By executing leaders, it elevated their memory into legend. By demanding sacrifice, it forced Christians to define themselves with clarity, to bow or to stand, to betray or to endure. Rome had tried to crush faith with laws, prisons, and fire. Yet faith proved to be iron wrapped in flesh, wounded but unbroken. And so, as the ashes of burned scriptures drifted into the wind, one reflection rose above the ruins. Can fire consume truth, or does truth, once planted in the soul, blaze brighter than any empire's flame? The Roman Empire was not only a world of soldiers and emperors, but of thinkers. Philosophy filled its schools, religion its temples, and rhetoric its forums. Ideas were weapons as sharp as swords, shaping how people understood life, death, and the divine. In this arena, Christians faced opponents as formidable as lions in the Colosseum. Pagan philosophers who mocked their faith, and skeptics who branded them fools. Among the most famous critics was Celsus, a philosopher of the 2nd century. In his treatise The True Word, he dismissed Christianity as superstition for the uneducated, a faith of women, slaves, and children. He scoffed at the idea of a God who would take human flesh, calling it absurd that divinity would lower itself to mortality. To him, Christians were traitors to reason and to Rome, undermining the harmony of empire with their stubborn exclusivity. Porphyry, another pagan intellectual, sharpened the attack in the 3rd century. A disciple of Plotinus, he admired the lofty heights of Neoplatonism and saw in Christianity only ignorance. He accused believers of twisting scripture, of rejecting the wisdom of philosophy for myths. For Porphyry, salvation was found in contemplation of the eternal, not in the suffering of a crucified man. These voices echoed in lecture halls and forums, where students debated the worth of new and old ideas. To many educated Romans, Christianity seemed a religion for the weak, an inversion of values. Strength was Rome's virtue, weakness was its shame. How, they asked, could a dying criminal on a cross be called Lord? But the Christians did not remain silent. Just as apologists like Justin and Tertullian had defended the faith against legal accusations, others rose to answer philosophy with philosophy. Origen of Alexandria, brilliant and tireless, wrote his Contra Celsum a massive rebuttal to Celsus's attacks. He argued that Christianity was not irrational, but fulfilled the deepest truths philosophy sought. Reason and faith, he insisted, were not enemies but allies, both leading to God. Origen's defense was not merely intellectual. His life bore the marks of persecution, imprisonment, torture, and scars he carried until death. His words carried the weight of both mind and body, philosophy and witness. The debates between pagans and Christians revealed a deeper struggle, two visions of reality. Pagan philosophy sought harmony through reason, tradition, and the many gods who upheld Rome's order. Christianity proclaimed a singular truth, a kingdom not of this world, a God who entered suffering and transformed it. One exalted the strength of empire, the other exalted the weakness of the cross. In this contest, the Christians held a paradoxical strength. While philosophers spoke to the elite, the gospel spoke to the multitude. It gave dignity to slaves, meaning to suffering, hope to the poor. Its appeal was not confined to classrooms, but spread through marketplaces, workshops, and homes. Yet its intellectual defenders ensured it could also stand in the courts of reason, not only in the fires of martyrdom. As the centuries turned, the tide began to shift. The very criticisms once leveled against Christianity, that it was irrational, unworthy, absurd, began to falter as the faith endured persecution after persecution. Rome's gods had not preserved the empire from plague or invasion. The philosopher's wisdom, though lofty, offered little comfort to the dying. But the Christians, through word and deed, offered both meaning and community. Still, the questions lingered. Could the cross, symbol of shame, truly be wisdom? Could weakness truly be strength? Could truth belong to those despised by the world? The debates would continue for centuries, even after Christianity gained power. But in these early struggles, something profound was revealed. That the faith of the crucified was not afraid of reason, nor ashamed of philosophy. It was, in fact, sharpened by opposition, refined by argument, strengthened by the very voices that sought to silence it. Thus, the clash of philosophers, pagans, and Christians was not a footnote to persecution, it was its twin, a battlefield of ideas where victory was measured not in executions, but in endurance of truth. And so we leave this contest with a question that bridges centuries. What is the greater wisdom? That which seeks to rise above suffering, or that which dares to descend into it and call even pain a path to truth? When the fires of persecution cooled and the empire's grip loosened, not all Christians rejoiced in peace. For some, survival itself raised new questions. If faith had been forged in suffering, what would become of it in comfort? If martyrdom was no longer demanded, how could one still give all to Christ? Their answer lay not in palaces or parishes, but in the wilderness. The deserts of Egypt, Syria, and Palestine became the unlikely cradle of a new movement, the rise of the Desert Fathers. These men, and later women, withdrew from the clamor of city life to dwell in solitude, seeking God in silence and austerity. They were not fleeing persecution, but temptation. They saw, in wealth, in power, even in ordinary routines, the danger of distraction. To them, the empire was not only in Caesar's palace, it was in every compromise of the soul. One of the earliest and most famous was Anthony of Egypt. Born to wealth, he heard the gospel read one day, "Go, sell all you have, give to the poor, and follow me." Taking the words literally, he abandoned his inheritance, retreated into the desert, and began a life of prayer, fasting, and struggle. His solitude drew others, until the desert, once empty, rang with the hymns of countless seekers. The stories of Antony tell of battles not with soldiers but with demons. In caves and tombs he endured visions of monstrous beasts, assaults of fear and despair. Yet he emerged from these struggles with serenity, his face radiant with peace. To those who visited him, he became a living witness that the soul, like the martyr's body, could endure fire and emerge transformed. Others followed, Pachomius, who organized monastic communities where solitude became shared discipline, Macarius, whose wisdom drew pilgrims, women like Syncletica, who sought God with equal fervor. Together they wove a new pattern of Christian life: asceticism, devotion, silence. The desert was harsh, the sun scorched by day, the cold bit by night, and hunger gnawed always. Yet in this barrenness, the monks claimed to find abundance, for stripped of all else, they confronted themselves, and in doing so, encountered God. To them, the wilderness was not emptiness, but freedom. The sayings of the Desert Fathers, preserved in collections, reveal their paradoxical wisdom. One said, "Go, sit in your cell, and your cell will teach you everything." Another, The one who knows he is a sinner is greater than the one who raises the dead. Their words were simple, even stark, yet carried depths that echoed through centuries. What had begun as withdrawal became a movement. From the deserts of Egypt, monastic life spread across Christendom. Communities formed in mountains, valleys, islands, places of retreat that became schools of prayer. The blood of martyrs had once been the seed of the church. Now the silence of monks became its heartbeat. And yet, this was not escape from the world. Many who fled the cities became counselors to those who remained. Emperors sought their advice. Pilgrims carried their wisdom back to towns. The Desert Fathers, in seeking solitude, became paradoxically the teachers of multitudes. Their flight into wilderness reveals something profound. Persecution by empire may cease, but the struggle within the soul never ends. The true enemy was not always a soldier with a sword, but pride, lust, anger, despair. To conquer these was no less heroic than to face beasts in the arena. In the solitude of the desert, Christianity discovered a new form of martyrdom, the martyrdom of daily self-denial, of silence, of prayer unceasing. If Rome once tried to kill the faith with fire, the Desert Fathers sought to keep it alive with discipline. Their legacy endures, for they remind us that the greatest battles are often unseen, fought not in arenas of stone, but in the chambers of the heart. And so, from the deserts, a reflection rises like the shimmer of heat upon the horizon. Is true freedom found in escaping persecution, or in conquering the chains that bind the soul from within? The empire reeled from the weight of Diocletian's great persecution. Prisons had overflowed, churches had been torn down, and scriptures burned. Yet the faith endured, growing not weaker, but stronger in the shadows. When Diocletian retired in 305 CE, the burden of rule passed to his Caesars. Among them was Galerius, iron-willed, ruthless, and bitterly hostile toward Christians. For years, Galerius had been the fiercest advocate of suppression. He believed the empire could not survive while this obstinate sect defied its gods. Under his authority, persecution raged most brutally in the East. Entire communities were harried, bishops executed, families scattered. To him, Christianity was a cancer that had to be cut out. But history has its ironies, and Galerius would become a figure of paradox, for the very man who stoked the fire would one day extinguish it. By 311 CE, Galerius was gravely ill. Ancient sources describe his body wasting away with a disease so hideous that even his physicians recoiled. Ulcers consumed him, his flesh rotted, and the stench of decay filled his chambers. Superstition gnawed at him. Was this divine punishment for his war against the Christians? Was the God he had despised now exacting vengeance? Racked with pain and fear, Galerius did something no one expected. He issued an edict of toleration. From Nicomedia, he proclaimed that Christians, though stubborn, would be permitted to exist. They were granted freedom to assemble and to worship their God, provided they prayed for the empire's well-being. The words of the edict reveal both pride and desperation. Galerius admitted that persecution had failed. Despite our efforts, many persisted in their determination. We therefore grant indulgence that they may once more be Christians. The language dripped with condescension, but beneath it lay a stunning truth. The empire, for the first time, had conceded that Christianity could not be destroyed. To the Christians, the edict was both relief and vindication. After years of blood and ashes, they could worship more openly. Prison doors opened, bishops returned, churches began to rise from ruins. For many it seemed like dawn after the longest night, yet the memory of suffering was not erased. Families still mourned their dead, scars still marked the bodies of survivors, and suspicion lingered, for toleration was fragile, granted by a dying man whose motives were uncertain. Could Christians truly trust the empire that had so long sought to erase them? Galerius himself did not live long after his edict. Within days he died in agony, his body consumed by the disease that had humbled him. His name passed into history as both persecutor and penitent, tyrant and reluctant benefactor. The paradox of his reign echoed in the minds of believers. The hand that struck them had also lifted the burden. But more than his personal fate, the Edict of 311 marked a turning point. The age of persecution had reached its twilight. Shadows remained, and storms still threatened, but the path toward acceptance had begun. Rome had discovered a truth it could not undo. Christianity was not a passing sect, nor a rebellion that could be stamped out. It was a faith that had survived fire, sword, exile, and ridicule. It had outlasted emperors, defied edicts, and endured silence. Now, even the persecutors themselves acknowledged its permanence. For the Christians, Galerius's edict was not triumph, but testimony. It proved what they had long believed, that no empire, however mighty, could extinguish the flame kindled in the soul. And so, as the last shadows of persecution under Galerius faded, one reflection lingered, sharper than ever. When power bends at last to truth, is it not proof that truth had been stronger all along? The year was 312 CE, and Rome itself was poised on the edge of change. Civil war raged across the empire as rival emperors battled for power. Among them was Constantine, son of Constantius, hardened by campaigns and driven by ambition. His rival was Maxentius, entrenched in Rome, fortified by armies, and confident in his gods. Their fateful clash would be remembered not only for military triumph, but for a vision that altered history. According to ancient accounts, on the eve of battle, Constantine lifted his eyes toward the sky and beheld a sign. Some say it was a cross of light shining above the sun. Others tell of a dream where Christ appeared bearing the words, "In this sign conquer." Whether vision, dream, or legend, the experience seared itself into memory. Constantine, once indifferent to the faith, now marked his soldiers' shields with the sign of the cross. The armies met at the Milvian Bridge, just north of Rome. The Tiber flowed dark beneath the bridge, its waters soon to be filled with the bodies of the fallen. Maxentius, confident of victory, had even consulted Rome's gods for omens. But when the clash came, it was Constantine's troops who pressed forward, their banners bearing the unfamiliar symbol. Chaos consumed Maxentius's ranks. As his army broke, he himself fled across the bridge, only to be swallowed by the river's depths. The victory was swift, decisive, and, to Constantine, divine. Entering Rome as conqueror, he attributed his triumph not to Jupiter, not to Mars, but to the God of the Christians. From that moment, the empire shifted. Constantine, though not yet baptized, extended unprecedented favor to the once despised faith. He ordered the end of persecutions, restored confiscated property, and began to grant the church privileges previously reserved for Rome's temples. A year later, in 313 CE, Constantine and his co-emperor Licinius issued the Edict of Milan. Its words resounded like a dawn breaking after centuries of night. We grant to Christians and to all others full authority to follow whatever worship each man has desired. At last, Christianity was not merely tolerated, it was legalized, protected, given space to flourish in public life. The change was astonishing. Where once believers had whispered hymns in catacombs, now they sang in basilicas raised with imperial patronage. Where once scriptures were burned in flames, now scribes copied them in the light of day. Bishops who had hidden in exile now walked openly in the halls of power. But Constantine's support was not only political, it was symbolic. He commissioned churches in Rome, Jerusalem, and beyond. He placed the sign of the cross upon coins, standards, and monuments. His mother, Helena, made pilgrimage to the Holy Land, seeking relics of Christ's passion. The once shameful cross, symbol of criminal death, began its transformation into the emblem of empire. Yet with this transformation came questions. Was the faith, once purified by persecution, now at risk of compromise through power? Could the Church, allied with emperors, retain the spirit of martyrdom that had given it strength? Some rejoiced at newfound peace, others warned of dangers hidden within victory. Constantine himself remained a complex figure. He embraced Christianity, yet also retained elements of Rome's old traditions. He presided over councils, involved himself in disputes, sought unity within the Church as a matter of imperial policy. To some, he was God's chosen instrument. To others, a ruler who mingled the holy with the political. Still, for the Christians of his time, his reign was nothing short of miraculous. The terror of Diocletian's prisons lay scarcely a decade behind them. Many had lived through the years when faith meant chains or death. To walk freely, to worship openly, to see their faith honored by an emperor, it was like living in another world. The vision of the cross before the Milvian Bridge became more than legend. It became the turning point where the persecuted faith began its ascent to power, where shadows gave way to dawn. Whether one sees it as miracle, myth, or political genius, it altered the trajectory of history forever. And so, from Constantine's vision, rises a reflection that reaches beyond empire. When faith is lifted from the margins to the throne, does it gain strength or risk losing the fire that once made it endure? The Edict of Milan in 313 CE changed the course of history. For the first time, Christianity was not merely tolerated but protected, raised from the shadows into the sunlight of imperial favor. The transition was breathtaking. Within a single generation, the Church traveled from the catacombs to basilicas, from prisons to palaces, from whispered hymns to choirs that filled marble halls. For centuries, Christians had defined themselves by suffering. Their heroes were martyrs, men and women who defied the empire and paid with blood. Their identity was forged in persecution, their memory preserved in silence and secrecy. Now, that identity faced a new test. What happens when the persecuted become the privileged? Constantine, ever pragmatic, saw Christianity not only as personal conviction, but as political instrument. He sought unity for an empire fractured by rivalries and wars. The Church, with its bishops and networks, offered structure, yet the same faith that had survived persecution was far from unified. Disputes over doctrine simmered, threatening the very harmony Constantine prized. To address this, he convened the Council of Nicaea in 325 CE, summoning bishops from across the empire. They gathered beneath imperial banners, debating the nature of Christ. Was he of the same essence as the Father, or a created being? The dispute, known as the Arian controversy, threatened to split the Church. For the first time, theology unfolded not only in hidden rooms but under the gaze of emperors. The council produced the Nicene Creed, a statement of faith that still echoes through centuries. Light from light, true God from true God. Yet its very existence revealed the new reality. Christian doctrine was now inseparable from imperial policy. The faith that once stood apart from Caesar now sat in his councils. Basilicas rose where once catacombs lay, the Lateran in Rome, Hagia Eirene in Constantinople, the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem, monuments of stone that proclaimed Christianity's new place at the heart of empire. Once, believers had gathered in silence for fear of arrest. Now, their worship thundered beneath gilded ceilings. But not all welcomed this transformation. Some remembered the purity of persecution, when faith meant sacrifice, when identity was sharpened by danger. Could the Church, safe and powerful, retain its soul? The Desert Fathers, retreating into wilderness, were in part a response to this very question. They sought in silence what they feared would be lost in splendor. The paradox deepened. Where once Christians were accused of undermining the state, now they were accused of being too entangled with it. Where once their danger was from emperors, now their danger was from within: ambition, division, complacency. Still, the memory of blood was not erased. Martyrs remained venerated, their tombs visited by pilgrims, their stories retold. Their endurance became the foundation upon which new generations stood. The Church's power was built not only on imperial favor, but on the unshakable memory of those who had died for faith. Rome itself began to change. Pagan temples were abandoned, sacrifices declined, old rituals faded. Christianity spread through cities and villages, not only by persuasion, but by imperial encouragement. By the end of the century, under Theodosius, Christianity would even be declared the official religion of the empire. What had begun as a forbidden sect was now the soul of Rome. Yet this triumph carried irony. The Church, once purified by fire, was now entangled with politics. Bishops wielded influence at court. Emperors intervened in disputes of doctrine. The faith of martyrs had become the faith of rulers, a transformation both glorious and perilous. For the persecuted, victory had come. But was it the same victory they had once imagined? The silence of the catacombs gave way to the voices of councils. The blood of arenas gave way to the gold of basilicas. Thus we are left with a question as enduring as history itself. Is faith at its strongest when it suffers in weakness, or when it rules in strength? The story that began in shadows ends in light, but not without scars. Across 3 centuries, from Nero's torches to Constantine's banners, the Christians walked a path carved in fire and blood. They endured slander, exile, prisons, and death. They whispered prayers in catacombs, sang hymns in arenas, and carried fragments of scripture through the flames of destruction. And yet they endured. More than that, they prevailed. The empire that once sought to erase them became the empire that carried their cross upon its standards. The faith of fishermen and slaves, women and children, martyrs and bishops spread into palaces, councils, and laws. The transformation was astonishing, a reversal no philosopher or emperor could have imagined. But what do we make of this journey? What is the meaning of persecution and of triumph? Memory as resistance. At every stage the Christians remembered. They remembered Peter crucified upside down, Paul beheaded on the road outside Rome, Blandina's frail body enduring beyond strength, Polycarp's calm voice before the pyre. They remembered Cyprian's serene silence, Lawrence's defiance on the gridiron, the countless unnamed who stood before magistrates and refused to bend. Rome sought to erase them, but memory resisted. In epitaphs carved into stone, in letters smuggled across provinces, in stories whispered by lamplight, the Church preserved its soul. Memory became survival, and survival became victory. The empire's power was in the present, its soldiers, its laws, its spectacles. The Christian's power was in memory what could not be burned, chained, or silenced, and in the end, memory proved the stronger weapon. Martyrdom as transformation. To the empire, death was punishment. To the Christians, death became testimony. The word martyr itself means witness. Each execution, meant to terrify, instead proclaimed that faith was stronger than fear. Each drop of blood became seed for others. Martyrdom was not sought few desired suffering, but it was embraced when demanded. In embracing death, believers inverted the logic of empire. Rome declared, "We kill you, therefore we win." The Christians answered, "You kill us, therefore we testify and we endure." This paradox transformed the meaning of suffering itself. Pain was not meaningless, it was participation in Christ's passion. Death was not defeat, it was passage to life eternal. The empire had no weapon against such a vision, for how do you conquer those who see death as gain? From shadows to thrones, the triumph of Constantine and the Edict of Milan changed everything. The faith that had lived in margins now sat in the center of power. Basilicas rose, councils convened, emperors wore the cross upon their banners. What had been hidden was now exalted. But triumph brought its own trials. Comfort replaced suffering. Power replaced weakness. The church that once defined itself by martyrdom now faced disputes over doctrine, ambition, and politics. Its purity, once forged in persecution, risked dilution in privilege. Some fled into the desert, seeking in silence what they feared would be lost in palaces. Others embraced the new order, seeing in imperial favor the hand of God guiding history. Both carried truth. The faith had survived persecution, but its greatest challenge might yet lie in prosperity. The fate of faith. What then is the fate of faith? Is it brightest in fire or strongest in triumph? The answer is not simple. Faith in fire shows endurance, the courage to stand when the world demands silence. Faith in triumph shows vision, the capacity to shape cultures and empires. Each carries danger, despair in the one, pride in the other. Each carries hope, the purity of witness in suffering, the possibility of transformation in victory. The Christians of Rome did not live to see what we see. They did not know that their whispered prayers would outlast the roars of the Colosseum, that their epitaphs in stone would outlive the decrees of emperors, that their memory would travel across centuries. They knew only that they must endure one day at a time, one choice at a time in faith. And perhaps that is the lesson. Faith's fate is never secure in power or weakness alone, but in the daily act of remembering, of choosing, of standing. Whether in catacombs or basilicas, deserts or councils, the endurance of the soul is what defines it. The eternal reflection. As we close this journey, the images linger. Nero's torches burning in the night, the roar of beasts in the arena, the silence of catacombs, the voice of Polycarp before the fire, the serenity of Cyprian as the sword fell, the cross in Constantine's vision above the Milvian bridge. These are not merely fragments of history, they are mirrors held up to every age, including our own. They ask us, what do we do when truth collides with power? When loyalty to conscience defies loyalty to empire? When silence becomes the loudest testimony of all? The martyrs do not answer for us. They only ask, with their blood and memory, will you endure?